Welcome to Discovering the Law. My name is Lucy Rivera and I am the host of this program. This episode can be viewed at www.discoveringthelaw.com, and we thank all of you for watching this program. Today we have a very special guest. We have Judge Paul Aaron Chernoff, who is here to share with us his life experiences and particularly about his book, both his books, but today his book, Bench Notes, a judge's reflection for his grandchildren. Judge Chernoff, we are so pleased to have you.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Judge Chernoff, tell us about everything you did before you got appointed to the bench.
Well, let me start with the fact I was born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut. I came to Massachusetts to attend Tufts, which is in Medford, right on the Somerville line, and graduated in mechanical engineering. Then I went from there into the service and went through a officer training program at the Naval Operations Base in Norfolk. Served 3 years, mainly on ships. I was stationed out of Seattle when I was on the ship Pathfinder. That's where I met my wife, because her dad was the captain of the ship, and my future wife, and we got married years later. She was a student at the University of Washington at the time. Then I went to law school in at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I worked for a short time as a patent lawyer, combining my engineering and law, but I really was destined for the courtroom, and I ended up as a public defender in Washington, D.C. for about 3.5 years, and I developed an interest in corrections and prisons. Came to Massachusetts, worked in the Department of Corrections here on policy and regulations. Governor Sargent appointed me to the parole board, and then he elevated me to the chairman of the state parole board's position. After 3.5 years, Governor Dukakis then nominated me for the Newton District Court. I sat there for about 8 years, and then in the second Dukakis term, he put me on the Superior Court, where I served for about 25 years.
Very illustrious career and so much to share.
Well, thank you.
Tell us about your book, Bench Notes, and tell us about what motivated you to write it. I think there is an image about the book that viewers can have. Please tell us.
I have 3 grandchildren, and I wanted to put in writing my experiences, things that I've seen over my career of 30, 40 years, people I've met, things that have impressed me, things that have embarrassed me, things that kind of show who I am, because I want my grandchildren to have the benefit of that in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And what makes that so important to me is that I had 4 wonderful grandparents. They were immigrants from the Ukraine and from Russia. My father's father was a milkman, and his wife, my grandmother, used to help bottle the milk in the basement, and they would deliver it. My mother's father owned a dry goods store in Connecticut, and he started off by selling goods from a cart in New York City. And his wife, my grandmother, had 4 children, and she helped the business, and of course she raised the grandchildren. And I know that they had wonderful, wonderful experiences meeting people and knowing people, and people who impressed them and didn't impress them, and they learned a lot from a lot of people, and I don't know any of that. I know them as loving grandparents, but I never had insight into the details of things that impressed them. And I thought that I would be important for me to give those things to my grandchildren.
Yes, and I wish we were all lucky to have something like this. What did you learn from writing your book?
Okay. Well, I learned a couple of things. In writing down all of these things, I ended up with 110 vignettes, stories of things that happened to me. And I first started to think that I'd give it to the children in a loose-leaf notebook, and that would be it. But then my friends and my wife Lynn, convinced me that it would be better to put it in a book form, and then I could share it with a number of other people. And so that's what we did. One of the things I learned, which came as a surprise, is that you should never, ever proofread something that you have written yourself. because there's something about the dynamic of reading something that you've written that's very forgiving, and there's many mistakes that you will not catch. And even somebody who knows the book, like your wife or friend, if they proofread it, they're not objective proofreaders. So I learned you don't do that. The second thing I learned is that if you make a mistake, you're not going to catch it, and somebody else will catch it. And that's exactly what happened with this book. When I had it in a galley form, which is just an early form, I was sitting in Logan Airport with a friend. We were taking a flight to teach a course someplace, and he took a look at the book, and he looked at the back of the book, and he said, "You have a mistake back here." I couldn't believe it, and the back of the book was a mistake. So I knew that my proofreading was not all that good. So finally the book gets published, and hundreds of copies go out, and I get a call from somebody one night, and they say, "Look on page 38, you've got a mistake." And I opened up to page 38, and it jumped out at me. It was just like it jumped off the page, and that's a page that I had read 100 times and never noticed it. And that to me was something. It's a bias that you have when you know something is there. It's called hindsight bias. If you know it's there, you'll find it. If you don't know it's there, you may not find it. Once you find it, you think you're a real dope for not seeing it before. So those are the two things that I really learned, two important things in writing this book.
And in your book, did you intend to have any moral for your grandchildren?
Not a one. Okay. I just intended to recount funny things, interesting things that I wanted them to know about that they wouldn't know about otherwise. I did not intend to lecture them on anything.
And so then give us a couple of examples of surprising stories that turned out to have a moral.
Well, let me tell you what happened is I didn't intend a moral. And then when I started telling the stories to the children, I started to explain them. And I could see that there was a moral to some of them. And I ended up concluding that about a third of the 110 stories had a moral. And so that would be about 35. And then about a third of those had really good teaching points. And that's what I believed for a while. But then after I told them about other stories, I was surprised to find out that almost all of them have a moral.
And what about stories that have a moral for adults?
Okay. Well, let me just tell you, if I might, something about where I was really surprised about stories that ended up having a moral.
Okay.
For example, there was a breaking and entering in Newton, a burglary of a house. And there were neighbors who saw the burglar run down the street and hide in bushes, and they called the police. And the police came, and the whole area, this is 2 o'clock in the morning, the whole area was covered with police, but this guy had nerves of steel. He sat in some bushes and didn't move, and they couldn't find him for an hour.
Wow.
Police going up and down the street. They had a canine, a dog there to find the person, and they couldn't find them. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. One of the police officers had to go. He had to urinate. He went over to the bushes, and he peed in the bushes right on this guy. And the guy stands up, and he says, "You got me." And so... And they arrested him, and they brought him before me in court the next day. And I just thought that was a funny story. No moral to it, funny story, end. But what happened is, about a year later, I sentenced a guy in court who had been in a bar and who was a tough guy, and he beat up 2 or 3 people very, very badly. And I sentenced him to jail for a period of time. And when he was in the courtroom, he broke down, and he was crying and crying. And I later found out that he, a big tough guy, was afraid of mice. And he was going to a jail, and he had heard that there were mice there, and that he was absolutely petrified. He had this, that was just a weakness on his part.
Right.
And then I started thinking more about this, and I thought about my own growing up. When I was a child, I lived in a house with 6 other families in this apartment house, and it was my job to go down the basement and put water in the boiler. and I was a young child, and there were rats in the basement. And I'd go down singing. I'd have a portable radio, just making lots of noise so I would never see an animal. And but you know, out of that came my own feeling, my antipathy for rats. I really avoid them. And you know, I have a son who lives in Washington, D.C., where there's rats all over the place. Doesn't affect him one bit.
Wow.
But put him near a spider, and he doesn't like that. So this story really tells you that people have different sensitivities. This guy here reacted to what the police officer did. Some people react to mice, some to rats, some to spiders, some to other things. I think the story really talks in terms of individual fallibilities.
But what about that's for children to learn about fallibilities of everybody. But what about adults? I wanted to ask you about that too.
Sure.
This is reflections for your grandchildren.
Right. Okay. But this is good for adults.
Too.
Some of them are good for adults.
Yes.
Let me give you a couple of examples about adults.
Okay.
When I was first appointed to the bench by Governor Dukakis, I was 37 years old. I looked like I was 27 years old. Nobody could believe I was a judge. I looked like a kid. And I was appointed in the wintertime in December, and I would go to the Newton Court with my parka on every night and pick up my mail because I sat in a lot of different courts. And one night there was an elderly woman at the door to the courthouse, and at 10 o'clock at night, and she was banging on the door, and I said, "Can I help you?" And she said, "Well, I was down at the Star Market, which is now a Shaw's, and I parked in the public parking area, and I got a ticket for overtime parking. And I went up to the meter maid, and I said, 'You shouldn't give me this ticket. I have a senior citizen sticker on the car.' And the meter maid said, 'Sorry, I didn't see it because there's snow on the windshield. You have to go to the police station.' So she says, 'I've gone to the police station right next to the courthouse, and they told me I have to go to court.' So she says, 'Here I am.' I said, 'Well, it's 10 o'clock at night. The court's closed.' I said, 'Can you come back in the morning?' So she looked dejected, and she said, 'Okay.' And she walks away from me. And I thought to myself, you know, she could be my grandmother. I said, 'Wait a minute. Give me the ticket.' I took the ticket from her. I said, 'Not guilty.' She says, 'But they said I was supposed to have a trial.' I said, 'You just had your trial.' She said, 'But they said I was supposed to go before a judge.' I said, 'I'm a judge.' She says, 'You're a judge? You're a judge?' And, you know, that's an important story because, you know, there aren't many male judges who look like Oliver Wendell Holmes, perhaps the greatest American jurist. And there aren't many female judges who look like Sandra Day O'Connor, one of the most wonderful Supreme Court justices. Most of us look like ordinary people, and you can't get by on your looks. You have to walk the walk and talk the talk for each and every single case, and you can't get away with it just simply because you're wearing a black robe. So I think that's a very important story. Another one of my stories deals with the obligation of people to communicate correctly with other people, especially if you're talking to a number of other people. You shouldn't talk over them. You shouldn't talk under them. Some people, of course, English isn't their first language, so you have to do it in a very, very sensitive way. It's like telling a joke and somebody doesn't get the punchline. Everything is wasted. And it reminds me of a time when I was in Paris. I went for a week and sat with judges in the Cour d'appel de Paris, which is the appeals court of Paris. And I sat with those judges, and at the end of the week, a number of judges took me out to lunch. And my French is a B, maybe a B plus sometimes, but it's certainly not an A. And I'm sitting with these judges, only one of them spoke English. And one of the judges says, j'ai une blague pour tout le monde. I have a joke for everyone, and I understood that. He says, afin d'être un bon juge, in order to be a good judge, I understood that. Il faut avoir trois choses. It's required to have three things. I understood that. He says, la sagesse de Solomon, the wisdom of Solomon, la patience de Job, et une vessie forte. And everybody laughs and laughs and laughs. I missed the punchline. because I didn't know what a vessie fort is. And they're laughing and laughing, and finally the one judge who spoke English comes over to me, and he says, in order to be a good judge, you have to have the wisdom of Solomon, the patience of Job, and a strong bladder. And so that was a failure of communication. And so to me, that's an important story. Another important story, perhaps the most important of all, I was invited by my courtroom clerk to his home on Cape Cod for a neighborhood barbecue. And my wife and I went down there, and while we're standing around in front of his house, his across-the-street neighbor comes over, and she says to me, I understand you're a judge. And I said, yes. She says, do you know Judge so-and-so from Cape Cod? And I said, no. She said, I've never hated anybody more than I hate that man. I absolutely detest him. I've never hated anybody more in this world. I said, oh. She says, and you know, I've always wanted to kill him.
Oh,
and last month I had a chance to kill him because, you see, he was in my court. Incidentally, he was the judge in my divorce case. But he was in my court. He was in the operating room, and he was having open heart surgery. And I was in charge of his anesthesia. And he didn't recognize me, but I recognized him. And I knew that I could end it all for him, and nobody would know the better. I thought about doing that, but I didn't do it. And he came out of the operation, and he's just fine. So I said to her rather naively, well, you know, you must have not liked the result of your divorce trial. She said, oh, no, he gave me everything my lawyer asked for. The only thing is, he never looked at me. He never talked to me. He never acknowledged my presence. I was in his courtroom at least 5 times. He talked to my husband. He talked to my husband's lawyer. He talked to my lawyer. He never even looked at me. Anytime I was in court, I was a non-entity. I was never more insulted my whole life. And I've always hated him for it, and I almost killed him for it. So to me, that's a very powerful, powerful story. And as a matter of fact, what I do all the time, when I go into a courtroom, I always acknowledge everyone there. I sat in the Middlesex Superior Court this morning, and I said to people when I entered the courtroom, good morning, everyone. I sat at noon this afternoon for a matter. I came out, and I look around, and I acknowledge everyone. And people sit at the different tables, defense table and prosecution table, and I always acknowledge the presence of every person. And it's really, I'm reminded to do it because of this Cape Cod incident. It's a very important thing. And then I'll give you one more. I mean, there's so many of them. But last year, my son and I and my middle grandchild, who was about 5 years old, 6 years old at the time, and my wife, we drove up to Vermont the first week of June because my son and I were running in the half marathon called the Covered Bridges Half Marathon. Okay. And that's on a Sunday. We drove up on Saturday, and it was raining. And we get to the area of Killington, Vermont, and we have a flat tire. We pull over. We try to change the tire. My jack is rusted, and we couldn't change the tire. And we looked around, and we saw there was a store in the area. And the store in the area was a clothing store that sold high-end sporting goods, sport clothing. And I walked in, and all the people there are Caucasian people. And I walk in, and I go from one person to another, asking if I can borrow their jack. And not one person would loan me their jack. Well, I have too much stuff in the trunk. Well, my jack wouldn't fit anyone else's car. Well, I don't own a jack. I must have talked to 15 people in there, people who worked there, people who were customers in the store. Not one person would help. And I had called AAA, and it would take 2 hours for them to send somebody. And so I was on a list for them to send somebody in 2 hours. So I go out into the parking lot with my grandson, and out there is an African-American man at his car. And he's opened up the trunk. Apparently he works in the store. I went up to him, and I explained the situation, and he said, sure. And he and I dug in the trunk together, and we got, and when he gave me his jack, he said, look, when you're through with it, just leave it over here by the front of the store, and I'll pick it up on my way by.
Wow.
And that's, to me, that's such an important story because I feel that people of color and people who are minorities have a much greater level of passion for and compassion for other people. And that's one example. And I could give you a number of examples. I think women more than men, minorities more than people who are in the majority. I take the subway into Boston 2 days a week when I'm not sitting in court. And when I'm coming back, it's always rush hour, and all the seats are taken. And so occasionally somebody offers me a seat. I always turn it down, but people offer me a seat. In 2 years of doing this 2 days a week, no man has ever offered me a seat on the subway, and it's normally a minority woman. And sometimes, if there's a handicapped person on the subway, I will say to a man who's sitting, why don't you get up and give that person a seat? So these stories really tell an awful lot. And so these are just 4 examples of probably 40 stories that have a great teaching potential.
I think this is an incredibly valuable source of morals and learning about people's nature. Tell us a story that is not for fun, but just a fun story that you think that you've started.
Okay. I'm a runner, not a fast runner.
Okay.
When I was a judge in the Newton District Court, I had run in the Boston Marathon at my very lethargic pace. And about a week later, there was a case in the court that I was presiding over where there was a young man from Boston College who was admitting to a crime of an open container, a minor matter, open container of alcohol or drinking in public or trespassing on somebody's lawn. And the police officer takes the witness stand and he testifies and he says the date is April 20th. It is 4 o'clock in the afternoon and the marathon is over with. It was marathon day, but the marathon is over with, and I saw this person doing this, this, and this. And at that point, the probation officer goes over to the police officer, and he says, "Officer, you are in real trouble with this judge, because at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when you said the marathon was over with, he hadn't come through yet." And the police officer goes, "Whoops, sorry, Judge." And so that's a good story. Just about about a month ago in court, a lawyer stands up in front of me with his client next to him in a drug case, and he says, "Judge, I want to make a disclosure for the record." I said, "Okay."
Yeah, sure.
He says, "I want you to know that my client got arrested for breaking and entering about a month ago." So I said, "Okay, thank you. That happens. People get into trouble and while they're waiting for a trial." And he says, "No, Judge, you don't understand. He broke into my house and he stole my property."
That is a great story.
It's a great story. I'm not sure it has any moral to it, but it's...
Well, I think it does. Your Honor, we have 2 minutes left, but you have a second book that you have not finished.
I have not finished it.
Tell us about it.
Sure.
I think it's really
important. Not a sequel to the first, but it's a book that tells, that actually has a theme to it. And the theme is to help other people. And the people, you have an obligation to help people, and you have an obligation, if people get harmed, it's a minimal of harm. And then to turn around and to try to help people. And I've got a number of vignettes which should illustrate that for the children.
Your Honor, that is so important. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I think you should come back to tell us about your second book.
Okay, I promise.
And for everybody watching us, thank you so much. There is so much to learn from Judge Chernoff, and especially his second book that we missed out in today's episode. But today we had Judge Paul Aaron Chernoff as a Superior Court Justice, visiting us today to impart some knowledge as to what he's learned in life. My name is Lucy Rivera. Thank you so much for watching Discovering the Law. You can view this episode at www.discoveringthelaw.com.